and welcome to all of you, both here with us today and also those checking us out and watching from our live stream at desalesmedia.org. My name is Stefanie Gutierrez, and I'm the press secretary for the Diocese of Brooklyn and DeSales Media Group. We are honored to be joined today by Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio as we honor Dr. Austen Ivereigh. Austen is the author of the critically acclaimed biography of our Holy Father, the Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. Before I welcome Msgr. Kieran Harrington, Vicar for Communications for the Diocese, let me take this time to ask you to please silence your phones. We, of course, encourage you to tweet using the hashtag WCDNYC, World Communications Day, New York City. And in case you're not connected to us already, on the last page of the program that you all should have received, you'll see a list of our new evangelization efforts and their social media accounts. So we'd love to have you follow us, and we'll follow you back. I also wanted to share with you that everything from today is being filmed, including this morning's pre-conference sessions. For those who were unable to attend, those sessions and other events from today will be packaged and uploaded online at desalesmedia.org in the coming days. I also wanted to mention, if you haven't already, to be sure to visit our sponsors in the exhibit hall and stop by WOR's booth for a chance to win some exciting prizes. Those winners will be announced at the networking reception later on this afternoon. And on that note, please join me in welcoming Msgr. Kieran Harrington.
Thank you, Stefanie. Before we begin, I just want to thank in a very special way Stefanie and Christine Mohan, Rocio, and Teresia, and all of the team at DeSales under the leadership of Art Dignam for really putting together and producing this conference today. They've done a really outstanding job with panelists, so let's give them a round of applause. This is the 24th annual World Communications Day for the Diocese of Brooklyn, and this is the 11th year that Bishop DiMarzio has been the bishop of the diocese during that time. And I think it's appropriate when you think about the theme for World Communications Day is on the family. And bishop of a diocese is the father of the family, right? And so if you think about a family and the father of a family and the Pope's focus on communication. And one of the things that the Pope just recently spoke about is that a family needs to know 3 words, right? The first word that the Pope calls us to remember is a family is may I. And you think about it is to be gracious. And so first I want to say, may I welcome you here to the Marriott Hotel in Brooklyn for this World Communications Day. I'm very grateful. I know that it takes a lot of time to come from all different parts of the diocese, a lot of traffic in Brooklyn, and so I know it's a great sacrifice. So may I welcome you here. I'm very happy to welcome you here. Second word that the Pope asks us to say is thank you. And so I'm grateful to you for the sacrifices you made, and in a particular way, I'm grateful to Bishop DiMarzio for the sacrifices he has made, because the resources that the diocese devote to communications is really unparalleled in many other places. You know, it's easy to do a conference when you have the resources to do a conference. And the only reason that we are able to have a television station and a newspaper and digital operations and all this is because of the resources that are devoted to it, and that's because the bishop, the father of the family, made that possible. And so on behalf of all of us, I want to thank the bishop for making that available to us. And lastly, the Pope says the important word in a family is pardon me, to say I'm sorry. And so in advance, I'm sorry if there are any glitches, anything that gets in the way of having a very smooth conference. And with that, I want to welcome Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio, the Bishop of the Diocese of Brooklyn.
Thank you, Msgr. Harrington. Thank you for your hard work in keeping DeSales Media together. We've joined so many of our resources into one organization that Msgr. heads with a lot of help from other people, but it's something I do think is working. As you see, we've almost doubled the size of this conference this year. So again, it's good to be here with you, especially I'm pleased to have the opportunity that we can honor Dr. Austen Ivereigh with the St. Francis de Sales Distinguished Communicator Award. On March the 13th, 2013, the world was introduced to Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and we have all come to know him as Papa Francesco. That evening, Austen Ivereigh was offering a commentary on Sky News. In the course of the following year, he began researching the life of Padre Jorge. In the first year, the new Pope endeared himself to the people of the world. Sometimes we were left shaking our heads, but he seemed to be someone interested in us, the priests, the bishops. We saw sometimes the sharp lines that have captured our imagination. First of all, I would like you to pray for me. Give me your blessing. Pastors must have the smell of the sheep. Warning against seminarians becoming little monsters. Who am I to judge? And in order to be good Catholics, we do not have to breed like rabbits. Sound bites take on a life of their own. That's the way we think today, unfortunately. We don't go much deeper sometimes. But sound bites get our attention, and our Holy Father has got our attention. And so too has this good book, The Great Reformer Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, which was written by Dr. Ivereigh. I read actually the pre-publication copy just before Christmas, and it truly was something that kept my attention. I couldn't put it down because I wanted to know more about this man who is our Pope, our Holy Father. Truly, there is a radical message there because he, after the following of Francis of Assisi, set out to repair the church, restore the church, something that is important in our day, clearly. At the same time, we've come to see our Holy Father as one who is walking along with us in the church through the Ignatian spiritual exercises. As Austen remarked in his interview for the National Review, I quote, "The spiritual exercises are one of the keys that unlock Francis. He became, from very early in his Jesuit life, a master retreat giver and spiritual director, absorbing at every level St. Ignatius' rules for distinguishing the movements of the Holy Spirit from other emotions, which can deceptively look similar to that of the Spirit, but which are in reality diabolic temptations. People are amazed by how often Francis refers to the devil. It's because he's very familiar with him." Those are the words of Dr. Ivereigh. In just a few months, Pope Francis will be among us. A time in the United States where the media is very interested in his coming. However, this interest is not just by the media, but also by everyone who is Catholic and many who are not Catholic. What words will he speak? What are the sound bites he's going to leave us with? How shall we be challenged to live more deeply our faith? Questions abound of what this Pope might say about immigrants, to which he has said much in Europe, about the environment in the upcoming encyclical, about the family, for which he's coming to participate in the World Meeting of Families. Also, he may say something about suffering and persecution, which is often one of his themes. We await his coming. And I think by the book that Dr. Ivereigh put out, we can understand more about him as a person, so we can understand his message better. We don't know what he will say, but we know we are going to listen. So I'm grateful to Dr. Ivereigh for accepting this honor we give him, a small token of our appreciation for the service he has done to the church in making Pope Francis better known.
Well, thank you so much. This is really very bad for the ego, but don't worry, I'm married, so it'll get taken care of when I get home. My wife will say, would the distinguished communicator like another cup of coffee? It's lovely to be here, to be at home. I feel very at home here with friends, with many distinguished communicators. Thank you, Bishop DiMarzio. Thank you, Msgr Harrington, who I first met last year on his fantastic show. And I'm so looking forward to being with my friends on the panel, David Gibson and John Favis, who are revered commentators for me. So thank you so much for giving me this award, for giving me this platform as well, with which to address you in advance of Pope Francis's arrival in the United States. I know you're excited. I am. What I'm hoping to do in these few remarks, and Bill, I'm indicating now that I'm starting the talk, so you know to put my slides up. I wanted to give you a few keys. Thank you. I wanted to give you a few keys that, to me anyway, have been helpful in understanding or explaining Pope Francis. Ever since I've been writing the book, of course, I'm being constantly asked to explain and interpret Francis. We live, of course, in exciting new times. You don't need me to tell you that, whether we call it the Francis effect, or as John Allen did in his book, the Francis miracle. We know that these are different times. President Castro of Cuba said just after seeing the Pope the other day that he's now thinking of praying and going to Mass. We have conservative Catholics complaining that their legitimate criticism of the Pope is being treated as dissent or disloyalty. We have the Pope being lauded as a turnaround CEO in books about business and about leadership. And of course, this is a Pope who appears on the cover of fashionable magazines. When I was with Cardinal Dolan just before Christmas, he told me that having a Pope on the cover of The Advocate, the gay magazine The Advocate, was a bit like him, Cardinal Dolan, being on the cover of a sportswear magazine, swimwear edition. I confess I haven't yet been able to get this image out of my mind. I've been trying. But whatever we call this effect of Francis, this extraordinary impact that this Pope is having, it's also true that this is a Pope who is creating enormous anxiety. Anxiety about the papacy, about the role of the Pope, indeed about the role of the Church in contemporary society. In other words, the Pope who is shaking things up in so very dramatic ways, reaching out beyond the Church, appealing to people in a way that popes haven't for many, many years, is also precisely the reason why many mistrust him. He is one of the most extraordinary communicators we have at the moment in the world. But in many ways, he's the hardest to account for, the hardest to explain. A journalist from the newspaper La Vanguardia in Barcelona put to the Pope last year that he was a revolutionary. Francis didn't reject the idea, but he said that the greatest revolution of all was to go to the roots, and that real change was about strengthening identity and not replacing it. One who goes to the roots is a radical. That's what radical means. And that's really been the basis for the argument of my book, The Great Reformer. I called my book The Great Reformer because I wanted to show that Francis belongs to a tradition of radical Catholic reform stretching back to the Middle Ages, to his great hero, St. Francis of Assisi. It's not, in other words, the kind of reform that you find on the lips of so-called reform movements, many of which are in the Church or outside it. It's a radicalism born of the need to focus, to simplify, to recover the forma Christi, to present Christ to the world in a way that is not confused with wealth, ego, pride, or power. Francis's radicalism is born of his extraordinary identification with Jesus, born of a lifetime of total immersion in the Gospels, and of decades spent in church leadership as a Jesuit missionary, and then, of course, as Cardinal Archbishop, but conscious from the very beginning of himself as a reformer. It's one of the things that came out of my research which most struck me when I arrived in Argentina in 2013. I said to the Jesuits, where are the Pope's writings as a Jesuit? I assumed that they had been published. They hadn't been. They gave them to me, blew the dust off them, and I went off and read them. Over 20 years of his writings as a Jesuit, it's very clear he saw himself from the beginning as a reformer. So Francis is in this tradition of true Catholic reform, of restoring what has got buried or sidelined. And it's specifically a reform in the tradition of the Second Vatican Council, which brought the pastoral to bear on the doctrinal. Now, the challenge in explaining Francis's reform is therefore, in a way, the same as the challenge in explaining the Second Vatican Council. Because it involves changing habits and structures in order to meet new circumstances, it's easy to misinterpret it as conforming the church to the world. Just last week, I'm sure you saw this, there were reports that Francis is sending out priests to absolve the terrible sin of abortion. And the New York Post described this, I don't know whether you saw this, the New York Post described this as the latest Vatican bid to catch up with modern times. But if the church were catching up with modern times by doing this, why would it need to offer forgiveness at all? What would there be to forgive? So it's very easy to misunderstand Francis's gestures and Francis's reforms. And I want to suggest to you that these 4 keys that I want to share with you today help us to do that. 4 key ideas in helping to explain how it is that Francis is making it easier, this is the object of the reform, to make it easier for people to be converted to the gospel. So the first key comes from the Dominican theologian Yves Congar, who wrote a book in 1950 which was very influential on Pope Francis, and it was called True and False Reform in the Church. It's a study of why reform in the church goes wrong sometimes. It results in splits and divisions, and other times reform results in greater zealousness, holiness, and unity. And Congar asked himself why some reform ends up in one and other reform ends up in the other. And he came up with a series of conclusions. And these are the 3 main ones I want to share with you. The first one is that all true reform involves an opening of the center to the periphery. One of the first things Francis did was to appoint a council of 9 residential archbishops, cardinals, in other words, who are not from Rome, and put them in charge of restructuring the curia. He opened up Rome, in other words, to the local church. He put the local church in charge of reforming the Vatican. He's made the College of Cardinals a kind of a senate which sits each year advising the Pope on major questions. And of course, most notably and most drastically, most radically, is the Synod of Bishops, which has been reformed now in such a way as to embed the dynamic of the Second Vatican Council permanently in it, bringing pastoral realities to bear on universal church policies. And I believe that these reforms are irreversible. They've already happened. In that sense, Francis, in 2 years, has already achieved a huge amount in reforming church governance. But it's an opening out to the periphery in other ways. It's an option for the poor, adopting the perspective of the poor. It's one reason that he wanted cardinals from remote, far-flung, poor places, and he appointed those cardinals to the College of Cardinals, even though in some cases they had very few Catholics. But he wanted those voices present in the College of Cardinals because he believes it's vital to listen to that voice from the periphery. So it's about perspective. Francis has always believed that when you look from the perspective of the poor, you see more. If you stand in a shanty town in Buenos Aires, you see more of the city than if you're in the rich part. But it's also reaching out to the periphery because he grasps that baptized Christians who have become alienated from the church and are often the church's strongest critics are not actually enemies of the church, but rather people who are criticizing the church from an often gospel standpoint. So that when people criticize the church for being dogmatic or authoritarian or clerical or narcissistic, they're using actually inside, they're using a perspective which has come to them subconsciously from a Christian belief. By making himself the Pope of Reform, he identifies with the critics rather than seeking simply to defend the institution. And by doing that, he's been able to reach out over the gulf that separates the church from contemporary Western society, reversing, in other words, the dynamic which has seen church and contemporary society in many ways come apart. The second criterion for Congar of true reform is that it takes place within the Catholic tradition. It doesn't question core Catholic doctrines or practices. It doesn't question the Eucharist or Marian devotion or a male priesthood or a hierarchical magisterium. And this is absolutely true of Francis. You'll see from the book that he is absolutely solid throughout his life, always enrooting himself in Catholic traditions. He teaches, in fact, a very old-fashioned Catholicism, but it sounds new because he's reframing, he's innovating within the tradition. The Synod itself, despite what you may have read, I was there, assumed throughout that church teaching on marriage and family was true, that marriage is between a man and a woman for life, open to life, and indissoluble. He has been a robust defender of core Catholic doctrines. The third criterion of true Catholic reform is that the object of the reform is pastoral. The purpose of church reform is not to democratize the church, to change its structures, to make it look more like the modern world, but to allow more people to have access to God, the sacraments, and parish life. The object of the reform, in other words, is the good of souls. It's what helps people enter into relationship with God. False reform, on the other hand, starts usually from an ideology. It tries to make the church look like something that it's not. So the reform movements within the church, which talk about democratizing the church and wanting women priests and so on, he would immediately recognize as coming from a false place, a place of false reform, because that kind of reform ends up in a battleground of elite projects. It's not rooted in the core needs of the people. He coined a phrase as a Jesuit very early on, which he started to use in the early 1970s. In Spanish, El Santo Pueblo Fiel de Dios, God's holy, faithful people. He always roots the church and his own reform by identifying with the ordinary people. So the structural reforms of the Vatican have a pastoral purpose. They are not the purpose of the reform. They are designed to enable the true reform, which is pastoral. They are a means, in other words, of achieving a pastoral end. The true purpose of the reform that Francis is carrying out is a change of culture and of focus within the church to make the church more evangelical, more missionary, more responsive to the needs, the concrete needs of ordinary people. The second key to understanding Francis's reform, I want to suggest, is that mercy is the key to evangelization. This is something that we are not familiar, we are not used to hearing in the church, that charity and evangelization are really the same thing. This has been true in the Latin American church for many years, but in Europe and America, we tend to see these two as being apart. The people of Buenos Aires will tell you that at Christmas, Cardinal Bergoglio used to take the baby Jesus from the crib and hold it up and say, "This is God. God is tenderness." This is the lesson that he is now seeking to teach the world by recovering what he would regard as the primary value of mercy, the primary characteristic of God, which is mercy. Francis has told people close to him that only in recent decades has the church began fully to recover this idea of mercy as the primary attribute of God, only in recent decades, following centuries in which, following the 16th century Reformation, God's justice was overemphasized at the expense of mercy. Of course, at Vatican II, it's John the 23rd who opens the council with those memorable words about using the medicine of mercy rather than the arms of severity. This is where this restoration, the recovery of mercy, began. And of course, it's continued under John Paul II, Dives in Misericordia, Pope Benedict's Caritas in Veritate. The popes and Paul VI, the popes since the council have emphasized mercy to a huge extent. And yet Francis is the first to really take it further and to make mercy the cornerstone of the church's strategy of evangelization. He's convinced, like Walter Casper, the theologian whose book Mercy he read, by the way, while he was in the conclave. He's convinced, like Casper, that the proclamation of a God who is insensitive to suffering is a reason that God has become alien and finally irrelevant to many human beings. Francis believes that the church will only be credible when it offers the merciful face of God primarily, that the first thing people see is mercy. Mercy in Latin is misericordia, same as in Spanish. Two words in that. Miseri are the poor, the suffering, the sinners, those who long. And cor is a heart. God is misericors, has a heart for the poor. God cares deeply about anybody who is suffering. The revelation of that knowledge, which, by the way, is quite extraordinary in terms of what we know from other religions, the revelation of that truth is, if you like, what must drive primarily our evangelization, our offer to the world. This goes back a very long way with Jorge Bergoglio, goes back to his childhood when, close to 17, he had an experience of mercy while in the confessional in the Basilica in Flores, where he used to go with his family. He was drawn in to confess that day, and he had an experience of mercy which left him convinced that he would be a priest. He believes that the experience of mercy is what unlocks people's is what unlocks people's hearts and minds and makes them able then to assimilate Christian truth. Which is why in the spiritual exercises, the first week of the spiritual exercises involves us looking back over our lives, realizing we've sinned and hurt other people, but also realizing that God has been accompanying us all the time and loves us and forgives us unconditionally. And that the overwhelming experience of that knowledge is what we take into the second week, which is when we choose Christ and we choose the church's teaching. So one way of seeing Francis's papacy is to see that he's restoring the priority or the primacy of the first week. You don't get to the second week without the first. In other words, if the church focuses constantly on its own clarity, on the clarity of its own doctrine, that won't be enough. It won't convert people. What converts people is the experience of mercy. Hence his declaration, as you know, of a special Jubilee year next year as a year of mercy. But here's the interesting thing. He's entrusted the year of mercy to the Pontifical Council for the New Evangelization, which was the council set up by Pope Benedict XVI in order to look at ways of reproposing the gospel in societies that were Christian but had become secularized. The question that the Synod on the New Evangelization asked itself is, how can we represent or repropose the gospel in societies which think they know the gospel and have rejected it? And that Synod had many different theories and there were lots of debates. This is the answer. Francis's answer to that question is mercy. And it's explained and beautifully presented in the bull which was issued just recently in April, Misericordiae Vultus, the merciful face of God, which uses the word credibility 4 times. He talks about how the church's credibility depends on its ability to offer mercy. Now, as you know, because you're involved in communication, that credibility is key to convincing communication. If you're not credible, however beautiful what you say is, you won't be listened to, you won't be trusted, you won't be heard. Francis is saying, unless the church offers the world the truth about God as essentially loving and forgiving, then forget it. The church won't be taken seriously. And this is really interesting because, of course, the reason people won't take the church seriously is that in our society, we already have an embedded subconscious knowledge of God as being merciful, which is why presenting the gospel in a secularized society, we have to often realize that the hostility we encounter comes from a kind of distorted Christian place. It appears counterintuitive to many people, this emphasis on mercy, because they say, in a world of relativism and of doubt, then what we need is clarity. We need, if you like, more judgment, not more mercy. But Francis would see this as a temptation, that when the church feels besieged, it tends to overemphasize its teaching and its doctrine. It emphasizes clarity at the expense of the other part of the message, which is the love and the forgiveness and the healing. That the two need to be kept in balance all the time. If you like, the light of Christ, as it was put to me very well by a Dominican just yesterday, the light of Christ is both illumination and it is warmth. And you need both. If you have too much light without the warmth, then people will shrink away from it. Too much warmth without the light, then you end up with something fuzzy and unclear. So this is about the restoration of a balance. On its own, church teaching cannot attract by the virtue of its own logical rigor. In a culture dominated by an ethic of autonomy, the church's narrative will simply be dismissed as one narrative among many. Because in an ethic of autonomy, it assumes that we are in charge of our own destiny. Mercy is both the antidote and the vaccine to that illusion. It is the way of breaking through. In a society dominated by an ethic of autonomy, it is a way of breaking through to hearts and minds. And this is what Francis is demonstrating constantly in St. Peter's Square each week. It's what he shows every time he goes abroad and he visits places of pain. He always now asks to have included in his itinerary places of pain, prisons, drug addiction centers, elderly homes, homes for the disabled, where he can demonstrate God's focus on those who are in need. It's why when he's visiting parishes, he takes detours into shanty towns. And why in St. Peter's Square, as I found for myself when I first met him and I had a ticket in the front row, he actually ignores the people in the front row and he goes straight down to the people in the square to be among the elderly and the disabled. Because those actions, his 15-minute catechesis is now part of a much broader catechesis, which is a catechesis of gestures and of actions that take place in the square. This is Francis evangelizing. So he's helping to close the gap which many of us in church communications have been very aware of for many years. Why is it that we who experience the church as a place of loving and healing and community, yet see the church described and portrayed as an intolerant, dogmatic institution? What explains that gap? Well, there are many reasons for it. And if this were another lecture, another talk, we could talk about it. But the point is that Francis is conscious of that dichotomy, of that gap, and he is able to bridge it through the merciful actions. When you hear people talk about Francis, how many times have you heard people say, I'm not a Catholic and I've got problems with the church, but I love this Pope? They may not yet, if you like, see the light, but they've caught the warmth, and that turns them towards the source. Francis wants a new culture in the church which embodies that mercy. In February this year, in 2015, he told the cardinals, there are two ways of thinking and of having faith. We can fear to lose the saved, and we can want to save the lost. Even today, it can happen that we stand at the crossroad of these two ways of thinking. For him, in other words, the choice is pretty essential right now for us as a church. We need to focus on the lost, concentrate on the wounded, shift attention to those who are distant, be a church for the seekers, not just for the dwellers. And this is what he is hoping for from the synod. The result of the synod will not be a change in doctrine. It will not actually be a change in discipline either, in sacramental discipline. The idea is to have a new attitude, a new focus, a new way of thinking about marriage and the family, which is not just about protecting the church, if you like, protecting marriage from infection from a secularized society, but healing and reaching out to those who have fallen victim to the loss of meaning of family in our society, which the church in and of itself has not been able to counter.